Our third presenter from this slot is Kian Delpech, who's studying a Bachelor of Science in Medical Radiation Science. Lots of discussion going on, which is great, but we might just defer that to the next gap. Thank you. So Kian is doing a Bachelor of Science in Medical Radiation Science, Savash. Kian's project is clinical value. Actually, let me just take that to the next slide. There we go. There's our wonderful transition. Kian's project is clinical value of virtual reality in pre-surgical planning of malignant hepatic tumours. I said that wrong the first time I said it. I think I got it right that time. Kian is being supervised by Professor Zhonghua with support from the discipline of medical radiation science, HDR Research Fund in the School of, the Curtin Medical School. So Kian, come up, please.
Hello, so is that, yep. Is that loud enough? Cool. So as Andrew said, my project is called the clinical value of virtual reality in pre-surgical planning of malignant hepatic tumours, which is quite long. So just for a little bit of context, and recent statistics show that over 2,800 Australians are diagnosed with primary liver cancer annually. And the two most common types are hepatocellular carcinoma and intrahepatic bile duct carcinoma. So the first one, hepatocellular, essentially means that the cancer arises from the liver cells themselves. And you can see an example of the tumours in the image on the top there. And for intrahepatic bile duct carcinoma, it just means that it arises from the bile ducts within the liver, which then ends up blocking those bile ducts often, and the bile accumulates, causing what we call ductal dilatation, which you can see in the image on the bottom. And for both of these types of primary liver cancer, surgery plays a very key role in their treatment. So just for a little bit more context, the liver anatomy itself is relatively complex. It has a dual blood supply coming from the hepatic arteries as well as the portal veins, and the blood's then drained by the hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava. And then on top of that, you also have this intrahepatic biliary tree, which produces and transports the bile to the gallbladder and the duodenum. And in this image, you can see there's kind of one main duct to the left lobe, but there is one to the right as well. On top of that, these things called anatomical variants are relatively common. So while the majority of kind of individuals' liver anatomy might look the same, it is common for there to be variations in some of the structures. So this is an example of just the variations, some of the variations of the portal vein. So the type 1 is like a normal bifurcation, type 2 is a trifurcation, and then there are other types as well. And variations like this are possible for not only the portal vein, but also the hepatic veins, the hepatic arteries, and the bile ducts. And so you can see how that kind of complexity means that personalisation of the pre-surgical planning process is very important. And at the moment, it's kind of based on 2D and 3D image visualizations of CT and MRI data. And that just kind of gives you an idea of the patient's individual anatomy as well as the spatial relationships between their tumours and the other structures. But it can be quite challenging being able to kind of retrieve all the information you need to make proper clinical decisions. And recently, in the medical field, advanced technologies like virtual reality are being increasingly used to overcome limitations like these. So my project objectives were to firstly segment the liver anatomy and pathology from the CT datasets for two cases, one being of hepatocellular carcinoma and the other one bile duct carcinoma. And then once those are done, being able to demonstrate those 3D models in virtual reality. So for my methods, essentially I was supplied with multiple CT datasets for both cases, and I had to input those into a software called 3D Slicer, which is an open source software that, among other things, is able to visualize and segment medical imaging data. And I just had to do a little bit of work essentially to make sure that the livers lined up on all the different scans, so I was able to use the information from multiple scans to create the single model. From there, I focused on the liver segmentation, and for the one case did it manually, and for the other case used a semi-automatic method. For both cases, I then segmented the gallbladder manually because it was relatively easy to do, being quite small. And then I focused on the pathology. So the hepatocellular carcinoma case is multifocal, so it has 6 tumours that I segmented manually based off their appearance on the contrast CTs. And then with the bile duct carcinoma case, you can't actually see its tumour on the CTs. So the pathology, the ductal dilatation, was what was segmented for those cases. And then I did the portal veins and the hepatic veins, again using 2 different softwares. One was a bit more general, designed for kind of veins in general, a little bit harder to use, and the other one was designed specifically for liver vessels. And then once I had my models done, I was able to demonstrate them on the MetaQuest 2 headset using the Slicer VR extension. You can see that's a little preview of what's to come. So you can see my segmentations for the first case, obviously the liver, gallbladder, the veins, and the 6 tumours. And while some people might think the colours are a little girly, I chose them from a 24 colour palette designed for colour blinders, just so it's a little bit more accessible. And then you can see my second one's obviously no tumour for this case, and I tried to stick with like a green theme for the bile ducts. And then moving on to the 3D models, you can already see how the 3D models makes visualising the structures together much easier. But you don't necessarily get all the information you need, particularly where, in this case, the tumours are in quite close proximity to the blood vessels. And for this case, you can see as well, the inferior vena cava is a little bit short, so that dark blue one at the back. Just because the quality of the contrast scan, I couldn't actually distinguish it from the liver in the inferior portion. Oh, go back. What is happening? There you go. And when you look at this one, it's quite interesting to see them side by side because the liver looks quite different, at least in my opinion, and the vessels as well. So you can see how it kind of varies between individuals, but you can also see the extent of that ductal dilatation, that green, very light green in the side and the left over the liver. And so I was able to achieve both of my objectives. You can see the stuff for the first objective, and when you look at my demonstration, you'll be able to see the second one. And having done kind of manual and semi-automatic automatic techniques, I was really able to appreciate the benefit of the automation, particularly with the liver. Having done it manually, it was quite time consuming. And while the automatic tool at the moment isn't very accurate, in part because of the pathology, it was so much quicker just to be able to fix up the automatic one compared to having doing the whole thing by itself. And again, with the 2 different methods I used for the vessels, the one that's designed specifically for the liver vessels comes from an extension called iVesselX. It was much easier to use, but I didn't end up using it for the first one because at the time there was issues with it working on the Mac OS version of 3D Slicer, and that's essentially the only reason. So at the moment with Slicer VR, only very simple actions are available. You can kind of move towards, or like move the model towards you or away from you, and then control the scene, kind of moving it up or down and scaling it a little bit. And ideally you'd be able to have more controls with the development of a graphical user interface, just to be able to do things like changing the different opacities, being able to turn on and off different segmentations, potentially doing screenshots or saving the scene that you're working in so you can just easily load that again. And also, if you try it out, you might discover that because you can move objects, you can quite easily grab something and take it out, and it's not very easy to put back together. So just being able to reset the scene would be quite good, because at the moment you either need to fully take the headset off and go do it yourself, or have somebody sitting at the computer doing it all for you. But there is the upside with the VR extension. A lot of the other studies had to create the model and then export it and import it into Unity. So being able to do it within a single software is quite good, because you can kind of create it, edit it, look at it. If you don't really like something, you can easily just turn that off and go fix it and display it again, which I thought was quite good. In terms of its impact, as the title of my project suggests, it potentially does have some clinical value in the pre-surgical planning, just by improving that process. And as well as potentially it could be valuable as a training tool for junior surgeons, just to increase their confidence by improving their knowledge of the spatial relationships, as well as potentially as an educational tool for medical students. And so in this project, I didn't necessarily test the clinical value itself. That is part of my honours project that I'll be completing this year, where we're going to be comparing VR to standard 2D and 3D visualizations of CT to determine firstly its its value for pre-surgical planning, as well as its value, educational value for students. And ideally, we'd also be able to develop that graphical user interface just to improve the usability. But another point from this is that it could also be a good idea to be able to establish the ideal parameters for CT acquisition, just because the quality of your model is heavily based on the quality of your scans. And so to be able to get ideal models every time, you'd kind of want that basis. And I'd just like to thank my primary supervisor, Professor Zhonghua Sun, for all his support during this process. Also thanks to Dr. Mayank Bhandari, who provided the cases and the data for this project, and also thanks to Carley, who was a huge technical and moral support help throughout this whole process. And thank you to the Curtin Medical Radiation Science Walker Scholarship Fund for financing this project.